Now, this past week, it is almost impossible for you to have not seen the story about another mass shooting in Maine where at least 18 people have tragically lost their lives at the hands of an armed gunman. And ordinarily, I wouldn't talk about a non-church safety and security incident on this channel. However, when I went through the background of the assailant, what fascinated me was the correlation between the assailant in the Sutherland Springs mass shooting and also the assailant in Maine. So I want to dive into a little bit about the story. And again, we want to start off by saying that the people that lost their lives, those that are in the hospital fighting for their lives, we want to pray. We want to be with them at this time. We want to lift up them. We want to lift up their faith communities. And we hope that the Lord can help us find a solution to this incident. So I want to start off by saying that our thoughts and prayers are with the families of those victims and those that are still battling their lives. So we're going to talk about the assailant now as to what do we learn. And here's what I find really interesting. Now, I can mostly say this, being a British American, April of last year, I became an American citizen. Now, I served 14 years in the UK police, never had a firearm, and since I've come to the US, I've embraced the firearm culture. I enjoy going to the range. I enjoy taking my sons to the range. But here's my point on this, that right now, people are calling for more gun control. Right now, they're trying to reenact or bring back, old legislation to say this is where the problem can be solved. And here's what I say, particularly as we go through the Sutherland Springs assailant as well and compare it to the assailant from here in Maine. Let's stop calling for gun reform and let's focus on what is the root cause. The root cause in 99.9% of these mass shootings is mental illness. So can I start by saying, can we forget about the gun control for a moment? And can we actually try and tackle what is the root cause of these incidents? And that is mental illness. I'm going to take you through the Sutherland Springs shooting. Then we're going to talk about what people are saying about this assailant in Maine. And I want us as the church body, I want you as a Christian to focus on what can we do. And the problem here, the root cause here is mental illness. Yes, the guns are playing a part. I'm not saying that they're not. But the root cause of all these incidents is mental illness. So can we stop right now calling for gun reform? Can we focus as a community, as a faith community, as a country to focus on what can we do to stop this mental illness? So the assailant in Maine, what are people already saying about him? Well, they're saying there was this disturbed mental statement. This is, if I can get my words out, a disturbed mental state. This is a statement from someone that used to work with him. This assailant had recently been fired from the recycling plant where he worked, and there's also an indication he might have split up with his partner. Now, colleagues at the recycling plant where he worked, they said this, that he started to behave violently and oddly towards his co-workers in the last year. What does that tell us? A change in his baseline behavior that got on people's radars to say this person is changing, started behaving violently and oddly. What this witness also said was that when I saw it was him, I was not surprised. Jeremy Bowen, who was Card's driver helper at the Maine Recycling Centre, said, I wasn't surprised when I saw it because I saw this change in behavior over the last year, a change in baseline behavior. What was causing that? We know now more than likely mental illness. And as we look at threat assessment across all these cases, what we look for are clusters of data, and we look for these stressors in people's lives. What causes these people to go over the edge, to change their behavior, to do things that they possibly wouldn't ordinarily do? And what we know about threat assessment is that there's these stressors in people's lives that can lead them on the pathway to violence. And then we have these inhibitors of those things that stop someone going off the rails. It could be the love of the family, the support of a spouse, positive coping mechanisms, a way to deal with stress, being on the radar, someone saying Simon, I think you're struggling right now. So what we know is that with these assailants, there's stressors that put them on that pathway to violence, and then normal people, say normal in whatever context you want to take it, most people have inhibitors in their life. Someone's going to say, I think what you said there was inappropriate. Let's pat this down for a little bit. Simon, you doing okay? How are you feeling? I'm seeing a change in your behaviors. We have these stressors and inhibitors that we see in all these cases. So when I've been looking at the incident in Maine, as a Christian, I've been really challenged because I'm thinking to myself, and I said this to my wife this morning, I said, who takes responsibility for that person walking in and killing at least 18 people's lives? Well, obviously, this assailant has to, but when we know there's mental illness in there, do we as communities, are we doing enough right now to help these people that are on that pathway to violence? And where does the system fail them? And here's something interesting. So if we go back to the Sutherland Springs mass shooting in 2017, when an armed gunman walked in at an 11 o'clock service, killed 26 people, one of those was Pastor Frank Pomeroy's 14-year-old daughter. When we look at that assailant's background, long before, I think around 5 years before that deadly attack, he was arrested, domestic assault charges, incarcerated, and during a rambling 20-minute confessional video, here's some things that assailant said. He said, nobody really knows why I'm suicidal. So there's an acknowledgement there that he is suicidal. He's not in denial. He's saying that nobody knows why I'm suicidal. He goes on to then say, but I think when you're under a lot of stress, sometimes you can't handle it anymore and you do outrageous things that you would never do, like hit a baby, he said. One of the things the assailant did in the Sutherland Springs mass shooting around 4 or 5 years before he walked into that church and took those lives was he shook a baby so hard that the baby had internal bleeding on their brain. So he's saying there, when you're under a lot of stress, sometimes you can't handle it anymore and you do outrageous things. He's telling us, when I get stressed, this is what I do. He also said, and this is around, remember, 4 or 5 years before the Sutherland Springs mass shooting, he said, the way that I handle stress with his stepson is how he handled all his problems with anger and outbursts. He says his actions can be tracked back to elementary school where he was bullied. And he said that you can only hold it in for so much. You can lie, you can push it away, but eventually it comes to the surface, Keeley said, you can't deal with it anymore. And then what does that then mean? So he can't deal with it anymore, so he acts out. What does act out mean for him? It means violence, like he shook a 6-month-old baby till it had internal bleeding. And then the assailant then said that in 6th grade, he started hitting others and acting out to combat the bullying, fighting back with violence to become the top dog. Now, interestingly, what he then goes on to say that it says unfortunately, this is not the first mistake, and this is not the last mistake, of probably many more to come. Unfortunately, I try my best not to get to that place. And then the news report responds and says, but get to that place he did, when 5 years later he would go on to kill 26 people at the First Baptist Sutherland Springs. Now, why do I start there? Well, when you look at that, predating that person walking in and taking 26 lives, there was mental illness. There was an acknowledgement that I have these stresses in my life. When there's not the inhibitors, this person goes on to cause mass extreme violence. The people around him were not surprised that he went on to do what he did because of his mental illness and how he deals with stress. He deals with stress with acting out. Acting out is violence, mental illness in there. And then the system perhaps didn't support him. And you might now say, well, Simon, this is a monster. This is a barbarian. This person killed 26 people's lives. They did, and he is. However, I want you to look at it in a different way and say, when the cry for help is there, is the system right now failing some of these individuals? And what can we do as Christians to come alongside these people and help them before they escalate to the point of violence. So let's talk about the assailant now from Maine. So what is coming out so far? So reading some news articles here, it says a lot of other helpers he was working with were starting to say that he was acting violently and oddly. So we know there's this change in his baseline behavior. He's acting violently and oddly. And again, people that he worked with said, I wasn't surprised when I saw the shooting in the news. I was not surprised. I thought it was going to be him. I wasn't surprised because I saw this change in behavior. Now, we also know that in July of this year, that he was sectioned for 2 weeks with mental illness because he was hearing voices in his head. And now here is the interesting thing. And then he threatened to open fire at the army base. Much more to come here. We know that he had served in the National Guard for many years, was very proficient with a firearm, making these disclosures. So the Sutherland Springs mass murderer said that I find it very difficult to control this sort of darkness inside me. When it comes out, I commit violence, mental illness, cry for help, telling people what he's doing. Then with this assailant, very interesting. Only a few months, July, August, September, October, where we are now, 3 months ago, he was under medical evaluation for mental illness, for hearing voices. And one of his statements was that he wanted to open fire at his army base. Quite often what we need to do in these incidences, make sure we're listening. We have our open ears and we listen. And again, it's easy for me to play Monday morning quarterback, but I'm putting this together for you to see that the sequence of events say, was this preventable? What are we doing about the mental health crisis? When people are saying take the guns away, what are we doing to help people like this? That is my question here. So not only was he sectioned because he said he was hearing voices, he made the statement that he was going to open fire at his army base, a threat of violence there. And then we know his sister-in-law has recently given a couple of news interviews, and she said one of the things that she told us was that he had these hearing aids, and he became convinced that he could hear people talking about him at the bowling alley and at the restaurant where he went on to take human lives. So he could hear voices, got his new hearing aids. Clearly there's mental illness in there. He's been sectioned for 2 months before. And then he says, when I'm at the bowling alley, when I'm at the restaurant, I hear people talking about me. So she also went on to say that when they challenged him, he would get mad and say that he overheard voices and that these people are talking about me and they're in his head. They also said that in the last few weeks and months that he went downhill recently, and they said that they tried to listen to him. They tried to tell him that nobody's talking about you. You know, this is something you can overcome, but clearly they weren't getting through to him. So his family were seeing some red flags. They were seeing a change in behavior. There's some reports that they were making disclosures to his National Guard. There was conversation. Are you seeing what we're seeing? There was conversation about this for sure. So he felt that people were talking about him at the bowling alley, at the restaurant. Interestingly here as well, when we look at this mental health crisis, they said that, she says, yesterday, as the story was unfolding, they said that we prayed that the assailant had nothing to do with this. But when we heard the 2 places where the shooting happened, my husband, the assailant's brother, rushed home. So as soon as they heard that it was the bowling alley, then it was a restaurant, they knew something was going to happen. The reason why, he'd made disclosures. When I'm there, I'm in a dark place, but people are talking about me. I can hear us whispering, and they tried to say to him, "This is in your head. You know, you can overcome this. This isn't real." So they were not surprised. So there's a lot in here. Actually, let me just go back here and summarize this. I started off by saying we rush to the gun question in this country, and I believe the gun question has merits. And I believe that we do need to reflect on our laws. We do need to reflect on these conversations. However, what I feel that we are doing is that we are ignoring the mental health crisis in this US. The guns are a distraction. When you look at these assailants, the reason why I've compared it to the Sutherland Springs mass shooting is that these individuals have profound mental illness. These individuals are displaying behaviors. These individuals are having cries for help. And how are we helping these individuals before they escalate to the point of action? Would we rather have this assailant walk in and kill 18 people, or for us to make those difficult decisions and say, prior to that day, we want to do what we can? I've told a lot of people about this. My younger brother in the United Kingdom works in social work, and his team have an incredibly difficult task. One thing that my brother manages is the program of the mental health practitioners, that when someone is put on a police hold, they have to say, yes, this person needs to remain on a hold for their protection to themselves or to others, or actually this person can be released back into society. Right now, I can't think of a tougher job. I honestly don't know how my brother does it, making those difficult decisions about people's lives day in, day out, when they might have made disclosure or behaviors. Incredibly challenging times. But for me, that is where I'd like to see our time and attention go, is the root cause on a lot of these incidents. We've seen this now. This is someone that has served this country. This is someone that has been in the National Guard for a long time, but people have seen a change in their behaviors. And there are these warning signs and red flags to say that this could have been going on the pathway to violence. The Sutherland Springs assailant was telling us that when I get mad, I can't control myself and I act out. So I urge us as Christians, as members of the community, to read these incidents and say, what can we do? What can we do more to come alongside these individuals that the press will say were monsters, that become known as mass murderers? But particularly in this latest case, there is enough to say that this is someone where there was a cry for help. This is someone that was in need. And what can we do before these incidents to prevent them on that pathway to violence, where we have the disruption and we can say that we've made a difference in that person's life? So a lot in there, sharing my views, but I wanted to just talk about some similarities that I saw between the Sutherland Springs mass shooting and what's been going on in Maine, and just make my comments, my view clear, that the root cause of this is mental illness, and we keep getting distracted by the firearms question. And what I'd like to say is we have gaps in our society right now in how we are supporting people with mental illness. And I don't know what the answers are. Maybe you don't know what the answers are, but I think having this healthy dialogue, talking about it, sharing our views, might lead to discussions to say, what can we do more in our churches to help people that have profound mental illness so they don't go and do these things? He will be known as a mass murderer. He will be known as a monster. However, there's enough in his background for me to say, where was the system helping this individual prior to them doing that? Very challenging. I don't know the answer. I'm sure you don't know the answer. But as always, I love to hear your views and opinions, so please drop them below. And I always like to end talking about a tool that we have that might help you, which is our decision decks. We have 6 different versions. I've got the threat assessment deck on here. I actually showed a card to a friend yesterday within this threat assessment, where there was one in there where someone ex-military was struggling with PTSD and was making disclosures about violence. What would you do? I sent it to a friend and said, how close is that to what we're seeing in Maine right now? So there are 60 different scenario cards in here, each based off a different theme. They're only available on Amazon. It's a great way to test your own knowledge, test your team's knowledge on what would you do in key situations. If you can get through most of those decks and those scenarios, you're going to be in a very strong place. Again, you can scan that QR code, or you can go to the link below to pick up a set of the decision decks. But again, thank you for allowing me to share my views with you about the tragedy in Maine. I really hope that we can move forward as a country, as a society, in how we deal and tackle with people with mental illness. And I would love your views and opinions below. I do my best to answer any comment or question which is posed down there. But for now, you stay safe, you have a blessed day, and I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.